Okay, so this is part two of the video on how to revise body paragraphs and what sort of organizational structures you might try instead of trying to do it chronologically, which I said in the last video is clearly, I think, a mistake, right? So first of all, let's do a little review. Let's go back to sort of the main claim of the paper, the thesis statement. We talked about revising those last time and how they might work, right? This is a different sort of example of a thesis statement that I think would work for a paper on the idea of death in Emperor of Ice Cream and Bullet in the Brain. Let me just read it quickly. While Stephen's poem, The Emperor of Ice Cream, offers a more typically fearful and sad picture of death, Woolf's Bullet in the Brain dramatizes a death scene alternating between joy and loss, emphasizing the idea that humans can more deeply understand their own happiness by confronting their mortality. Okay, so first of all, I think this is a pretty good main claim. I think these are all arguable positions. Some people don't think that Emperor of Ice Cream is fearful and sad. I think a lot of you might disagree, but again, that's the argument that you would make. And again, that's the reason for writing the paper. But if we think about the template I showed you last time, it pretty much works for what the author is trying to say about Bullet in the Brain. First of all, they notice an aesthetic choice or an aesthetic feature of the story, that they're going to argue that the story is dramatizing a death scene alternating between joy and loss, that the alternation between joy or loss is the aesthetic feature they're going to talk about. They've got a nice, cool active verb here, emphasizing, right? And then the theme that they're going to talk about is the idea that humans more deeply understand their own happiness by confronting their mortality. This is a nice thesis statement from a student from last semester, and all they did really was just follow that template I gave them, right? Aesthetic feature, nice verb, followed by the idea that the aesthetic feature conveys. Now, the first thing I'd tell you in organizing your paper post-thesis statement is look very hard at your thesis statement itself. What you want to do is look at the thesis statement and let that be the guide of how you organize the paper. In other words, your thesis statement is going to set up a lot of tasks that you need to accomplish to convince someone that this is true. So when I look through this thesis statement, I see a lot of sort of smaller subsidiary claims. Offers a more typically fearful and sad picture of death. Okay, that's something I've got to go prove now. I've got to go prove that it's dramatizing a scene alternating between joy and loss, right? So if we think about what the thesis statement does, it sets up a number of tasks that the author has to accomplish. We have to prove all of these things and give them check marks as we go through the paper in order to convince the reader of the overall main thesis. Stephen's poem seems sad and dark. The dramatic action in Bullet in the Brain alternates between joy and loss. The effect of this alteration shows Anders the central joy in his life. The author, Woolf, intends Anders' discovery to be a demonstration to the reader on how mortality itself can help clarify what it means to be happy, right? These are all sort of parts of the thesis broken down. There's not one way to do this, but I think this is a logical way. This is a way a student, like I said, from last semester came up with. The thing I would argue that you should probably do is to make each one of these things an individual paragraph or section of the paper where you try and accomplish this task. So this is paragraph 1 here, and what you're going to do in this paragraph is you're going to try and prove to the reader that the poem seems sad and dark, despite the fact that it's got ice cream in it, which is always happy and good, right? Then you're going to go to the next paragraph and you're going to try and prove to the reader that what's happening in Bullet in the Brain is alternation between loss and joy, right? And so on. These are claims. This is not a chronological telling of the story. These are claims that you're trying to prove. And the idea is you start with these and then provide evidence. The other thing I would say about the organization here is I'm going to quickly go over something called the Tolman model for argumentation. And Stephen Tolman was this philosopher back in the middle of the last century or so. And he came up with this kind of philosophy of argument. And basically he said that a good argument usually involves a claim, it involves data, and it involves what he called a warrant, right? All this really means is the claim is the thing you're trying to prove. A good argument has to have a claim. It has to have something that you're trying to prove. Data, another word for that would be evidence. It's the thing that convinces the person you're arguing with that your claim may in fact be valid. But just as important as a claim and evidence is what he called the warrant. That is the connection between these two things. If the claim is what you're trying to prove, this is like evidence for what you're trying to prove. The warrant is the logical relationship between these two things. I want you to think about possibly using this kind of argumentative model for organization of your paragraph in a literature paper. What I mean by that is you'd start off with the claim, the thing you're trying to prove, right? Then you'd provide evidence or data. In this case, what that means is textual passages from the story, quotes, incidents from the story that help establish the claim. And then you'd have, after providing these quotations or evidence from the story, you would give what I'd call the warrant. In other words, you try and reason through the quote you just posted, or not posted, the quote you just provided in your paragraph, and explain how it helps you prove your initial claim, right? So rather than going through chronologically, you think of your paragraph as trying to accomplish a task, and that is to prove this claim, and you do that by providing evidence and warrant, okay? So, how might this work in a literary argument? So this is a paragraph I've kind of taken apart from Lost in the Funhouse, a paper about that. And it's going to be dealing with a particular claim. So, in Lost in the Funhouse, John Barth utilizes his easily distracted narrator in order to draw attention to the fact that fiction requires accepted, if often unexamined, techniques or conventions in order to maintain the reader's suspension of disbelief. What this claim is getting at, it's saying that because John Barth has this sort of messed up, crazy narrator who always gets distracted as he's trying to tell the story of Lost in the Funhouse, that draws attention to us as readers to things that normally we just sort of gloss over as we're reading stories. We don't pay attention to the way that a story is put together or how it achieves what it does. So that when John Barth's narrator starts having trouble with the sort of conventions of the story, because things are going awry, we notice better how a story is supposed to work, and therefore John Barth's Lost in the Funhouse is his way of teaching us how a story works, sort of by showing us a story actually not working. Okay? So that's the claim. That's what Barth is trying to prove. The next thing would be data or evidence. And here we have textual evidence, stuff from the story that sort of exemplifies what the claim we just made. The story's narrator explains that Magda G. lived not far from them on B Street of town D. The narrator then further explains the initials blanks or both were often substituted for proper names in the 19th century fiction to enhance the illusion of reality, as if the author felt it necessary to delete the names for reasons of tact or legal liability. Okay, so this is a good example of the author getting confused and breaking down the narrative of his story, just like the author here is claiming, that we have an easily distracted author. And the idea is that these distractions are going to help draw attention to the conventions of fiction. Now, I would say that this paragraph is not yet complete because we've got a claim and we've got good evidence for it, but what we don't have are reasons to suppose that this has to go with this. In other words, I understand all this stuff happened in the story. I understand this is the student's claim. But what still needs to be part of this paragraph is the explanation how these quotes or these passages help further the argument that's being made. And that is where the warrant comes in. So the warrant would be the next part of the paragraph. In this case, the reader is not immersed in the fictive description of Magda because it is precisely the illusion of reality that Barth's narrator keeps intruding upon. The interruption declares loudly that the reader is being presented with a fiction, and thus the reader is shaken from the pretense that Magda is a real person from a real place. Therefore, the reader becomes all the more aware of the techniques or conventions necessary to create a believable Magda, because it is exactly such conventions the reader is being denied. So basically, if we look back at the paragraph so far, what the student here is saying, I think very clearly and smartly, is the fact that when the narrator breaks down his story like this, what's happening is we're becoming aware of the fact that this fiction is not working, that we're being denied exactly what fiction requires. And by seeing so clearly what we don't get in this kind of Barthian description of Magda, we know better how fiction should actually work. So the argument is that John Barth is trying to teach us how fiction works by showing us how it doesn't work. Right? And we think about it, there's sort of good news and bad news, I would say, in thinking about your argumentation this kind of way. I mean, first of all, the hard part, I think, is seeing the logical connections between your textual evidence and your claim. You've got to really think about, okay, how does this bit of the text prove this claim that I'm trying to prove? Once again, I'm going to tell you a common mistake I think students make is they assume that everyone is going to understand why they're quoting a particular passage that they're doing. That is not the case. You're going to need to explain to your reader why this particular passage proves what you think it does. And that's where the warrant comes in, right? So you've got to think logically about how these things connect up or how this particular section of the paragraph helps prove this section. The good news, if you look at this and you're one of those people who has trouble sort of filling out the length of your literature paper, and I think in some ways that might be everybody, right? It's hard. This is a pretty long paragraph once we do all the things we think we need to do. In other words, we've got a claim, right? Then you've got to provide evidence for that claim. Then you've got to provide explanation for that evidence. That takes several sentences more. So that you, when you make a sort of subsidiary claim in one of your body paragraphs in the course of writing your paper, it should do all of these things. You need to make the claim, you need to provide evidence for that claim, and then you need to provide explanation for that evidence. You may need for a particular claim to bring up more than one bit of evidence, so you're sort of doing rinse and repeat, okay? So let me go over real quickly what I think are the main rules or the sort of broad outline of what I'd like you to do. Okay. First of all, body paragraphs in your literature paper should not be organized chronologically. I don't know how to emphasize this enough. It almost always leads to summary and a paper that is not doing any analysis or very little analysis at all, right? Instead, begin with an argumentative claim that helps build your thesis, right? So after you think you've got a good thesis for your final draft, go back and think, okay, what do I need to do to help establish or prove this thesis? And each of those steps becomes an individual paragraph, right? So you instead begin your body paragraphs with a particular claim that you're trying to prove and a claim that will help build your thesis. Then you provide textual evidence for that argumentative claim. Usually that textual evidence is going to be passages or quotes. Sometimes it may be a particular incident that you need to re-describe, but once again, avoid just summarizing the story here. You want to analyze it. You don't need to retell it. You may need to bring up particular details that are important for the reader to understand, but you should assume once again that they've read the story, that they basically know the outline or the plot. Right? Then you provide argument and reasoning as to why the evidence or the text you're quoting supports the claim that began the paragraph. In other words, give me the warrant that ties your evidence to your claim, right? And then you can repeat with more evidence if necessary. All right, thank you.